Okay, hi everybody, and thank you for joining today's 2020 QCDR Measures webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of the Qualified Clinical Data Registry measure development process for the 2020 performance period of the Quality Payment Program. So now I'll turn it over to Susan Arde from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to begin.
Hi, this is Susan Arde. I'm a program analyst in core at CMS. I'm the core on the PIMS contract, and I'm also core on the eligible clinician ECQM contract, also Measure SPE. Today we're going to talk to you about the QCDR measure development for the merit-based incentive payment system, or what we call MIPS. Next slide, please. Standard disclaimer, many of you are on this call have probably heard this or seen this, but this presentation, like all the ones we do, is prepared as a tool to assist providers and is not intended to grant rights or impose obligations. It's a general summary that explains certain aspects of the Medicare program, but the discussion and the document's not a legal document. If you want to know about the official Medicare program provisions contained in the relevant laws and regulations and rulings, go look at those official documents. They're publicly available. Medicare policy changes frequently, as you all know, and links to the source documents have been provided within this document for your reference, so you don't have to go scrabbling around. And finally, we as CMS employees, our agents and staff, don't make any representation or warranties or guarantees that this particular compilation of Medicare information is error-free. We try our very best, but honestly, we will bear no responsibility or liability for the results or consequences of the use of this presentation. So, next slide, please. So, hello. Again, my name is Susan Arde. I am a CMS core for General Dynamics Information Technologies, PIMS contract, and Mathematica Policy Research, EC, which is eligible clinician, ECQM task order contracts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, and we've got a tremendous amount of information to talk over and present to you all, so let's get right into it. Next slide, please. So what are we going to cover today? We are going to go over the MIPS QCDR measure basics. We're also going to talk about the QCDR measure development, what's going to happen during the 2020 QCDR measure review for learning opportunities, and the 2021 QCDR measure requirements. We've also got, toward the end of this presentation, a set of resources, and as we always do, we will be taking, toward the end of the presentation, questions and answers. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn this over to Stacy Sams, who is the MIPS QCDR registry support team person. Stacy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Susan. Next slide, please. We're going to begin with reviewing the QCDR measure development, review, and posting process. To begin this process, QCDRs are going to work to develop, collaborate, and test QCDR measures. During this developmental phase, QCDRs do have the option to request a measure concept call with CMS and the PIMS team. We ask that measure concepts are submitted to us in advance of that meeting, giving us enough time to fully review the concepts. And during the call, we can provide constructive feedback that can be used in further development and testing of the measure. Additional information regarding measure concept calls will be shared later in this program too. CMS will then publish a self-nomination toolkit for QCDRs on the QPP website, and this toolkit contains a number of resources for your guidance to use with your measure development. QCDRs will then submit their self-nomination and proposed QCDR measures. For the existing QCDRs in good standing, with no changes or substantive changes from the previous performance period, a simplified self-nomination form that is pre-populated with the information from the previous performance period will be provided. Once a QCDR submits their self-nomination and their measures, the nomination and measures are vetted by the appropriate teams for approval. Throughout the self-nomination period, QCDR measures are reviewed, and the team may reach out to you for clarifications during this time if needed. In the few weeks following the close of self-nomination, all QCDR measures that were submitted will be reviewed. You may receive an approval, provisional approval, or the opportunity to revise the measure for it to still be considered for that performance period. Measures that are rejected will be provided a rationale as to why, and this will take us to step 6. After measure decisions are shared, QCDRs will have the opportunity to schedule a reconsideration call with CMS and the PIMS team for those measures that were rejected. These reconsideration calls are not available for measures that were rejected for being topped out, though. Once all QCDR decisions have been provided, QCDRs will be given a specification file for review and approval. In that file, we will also include the supporting QCDRs that indicate they have received permission to use your measure. And lastly, the QCDR measure specification files will be published prior to the start of the performance period. All QCDR measure revisions should occur during the approval process, and once specifications are publicly posted, revisions are likely not to be accepted from that time on. Next slide, please. Now we'll take a closer look at the CMS expectations and things that are looked at when considering QCDR measures for the program. One of the first things that are considered during measure review is the measure evidence-based. Measures that are self-nominated need to include relevant guidelines that are current and reputable. If clinical guidelines and or scientific evidence to support the measure are missing, we will likely reach back out to you and have that submitted in order for the measure review to be completed. CMS looks for the measure to be clinically intuitive with high appeal and face validity. The measure should be responsive to improvement activities or cost measures. For the 2021 performance period, QCDRs will need to be linked as feasible to at least one improvement activity or cost measure. QCDR measures should attempt to limit reporting burden for the eligible clinicians. And another main criteria that CMS takes into account is any evidence of a performance gap. The measure needs to include summarized cited evidence of a gap. If it's not available, you can submit a cited literature that will support a gap in performance and show a need for improvement. And we prefer that to be within the last 5 years. If the measure is submitted without any evidence of a performance gap, we will reach out to you for this information in order to complete the review. Next slide, please. In addition, QCDR measures should measure a meaningful quality action. This numerator will identify the clinical activity that is being measured for the defined population. CMS prefers measures that are based on outcome, addressing a health status change over process measures. They should also not duplicate existing MIPS, QCDR, or clinical quality measures. Part of our review process entails the review of retired, rejected, and current MIPS measures to look for duplication. And finally, QCDR measures need to follow approved specification and testing processes. This includes implementation and reporting feasibility testing. And the testing and feasibility will be discussed in further detail in this presentation. And now I will turn it over to Jocelyn Meyer, who is also a member of the PIMS team.
Thank you, Stacy. All right, we can go ahead and begin. Kick this off with the learning opportunities from the 2020 QCDR self-nomination, and we can go to the next slide. Each year, we like to review some of these common questions or issues that we encounter during the self-nomination, just to review with folks and perhaps provide guidance that you can take back and implement into your own processes. So this first one is really surrounding the performance rate submission and data aggregation for QCDR measures with multiple denominators or patient populations. You have a couple options in order to submit the data to CMS. So first option, you can designate within your self-nomination to either submit one performance rate. This would require the QCDR to aggregate the data by the QCR prior to submission. Another opportunity would be to submit the 2 or more multiple performance rates, and then you would need to indicate how CMS should calculate the overall. So, for instance, should this be a weighted average or a simple average? This data will then be submitted to CMS at the strata level, and then CMS would then aggregate that. And lastly, the last option would be submit an overall performance rate as one of the listed performance rates. So, for instance, you could submit all of the data at the strata level and then have an additional overall performance rate. This would require the QCR to aggregate all of the data within the strata and then submit that as the overall rate prior to submission to CMS. Next slide, please. Continuing on to the ownership and eligibility of QCDR measures. Approved QCDR measures must own or co-own the QCDR measure and must be active within MIPS. Excuse me. In the event a QCDR is no longer participating QCDR, we have a few options. It must transfer the measure's ownership rights to an active MIPS-approved QCDR that is able to continue support, and that would include both the medical and measure expertise to amend and manage the measure. In addition, the receiving QCDR could permit other QCDRs to use the measure. If the QCDR would like to submit on a measure that is owned by another QCDR, they must have the permission from the QCDR measure owner. Permission must be granted at the time of self-nomination so that the QCDR that is using the QCDR measure can include this written proof of permission for CMS approval. We do confirm permission during the approval process of the specifications by the QCDR measure owner. Next slide, please. All right, another learning opportunity is regarding the measure revision and alignment. For example, something that we see quite commonly is, say for instance, a numerator is adjusted, but yet the description doesn't reflect that updated numerator. So we always reach back out, or typically reach back out and make sure that the description matches the numerator, or for instance, the performance rate needs to be updated, the description. So just make sure that everything, if you're making updates, that it sort of is pulled through the entire specification. Next, we'll want to make sure that all measurement fields are in accordance with approved specifications to support any QCR-specific edits and approval. And lastly, we just really encourage vendors and QCRs to spell check, grammar check prior to submission. These will be posted at a public website, so we want to make sure that it's intuitive to those clinicians. Next slide, please. All right, during self-nomination, measure developers should scan for measures that are address same condition, outcome, setting, and harmonizing them to reduce burden, improving scientific viability, and increase importance. Harmonization should promote the use of very similar measures. This will increase the likelihood of benchmarks and compare across a larger cohort. We do review QCR measures to identify similarities and differences, and this includes the clinical concept, patient population, clinician type, quality action, and clinical setting. If a new QCR measure duplicates an existing measure, CMS will likely reject the duplicate and ask the QCR to obtain permission to use the existing measure. When harmonization is requested and not completed, we do review all the similar measures during self-nomination and approve only one of the duplicate measures. And when we do review measures that are competing, there are a number of things that we do take into consideration. It's not a lightly taken concept. We want to look to make sure it's broadly applicable, or if it's including more settings, that type of thing. So lots of different factors go into that decision. Next slide, please. All right, so now we'll transition from the learning opportunities and take a peek at the 2021 QCR measure requirements. We can go to the next slide. All right, the 2021 QCR measure requirements. CMS will evaluate all self-nominated QCR measures against the 2021 QCR requirements. Just note that none of the previously approved measures will be grandfathered in. They will all be held to that same standard. CMS will be looking for outcome-based measures rather than clinical processes, as this aligns more with the Meaningful Measure initiative to improve outcomes for patients, families, while reducing burden and moving the payment toward value by focusing everyone's efforts on similar quality areas. In addition, CMS looks for patient safety and adverse event measures, and also addressing appropriate use of diagnosis and therapeutics, promoting care coordination, and assessing patient and caregiver experience. And lastly, we would like to look at measures that promote efficiency, cost, and resource use. All right, next slide, please. Also new for 2021, CMS may approve a QCR measure for 2 years with annual review. This is aimed to reduce burden for the QCRs, but each year CMS will take a look at these measures to assess whether the measure is topped out, duplicative of a more robust measure, reflects an outdated clinical guideline, requires harmonization, or the QCR self-nominated measure is no longer in good standing. QCRs do have an opportunity every year during self-nomination to update their measures. So if, for instance, a measure is self-nominated with an outdated clinical guideline, QCRs do have an opportunity to update those during that time. And lastly, one of the other QCR measure requirements for 2021 is they must, as Stacy mentioned, they must identify linkages between their QCR measures, cost measures, improvement activity, and in future consideration, the CMS developed MIPS value pathways. Next slide, please. All right, this is the last slide regarding the last slide related to data collection. Now we will move into the testing requirements or the data collection requirements. So CMS encourages the QCR to collect data for 12 months prior to submission. This increases the likelihood that the QCR measure could be benchmarked. QCR measures must be fully developed with completed testing as defined by the CMS blueprint, which we will be diving into in the next few slides. And then the testing must be completed at the clinician level prior to submitting the measure for self-nomination. And we just want to take a minute or a second to note that CMS interprets data collection and testing to be unique processes. Next slide. So I want to take a minute also to really dive into why testing is so important. Testing assesses the reliability, validity, feasibility, usability, and scientific acceptability of QCR measures to assure they are meaningful measures. It is fundamental in reducing the reporting burden on eligible clinicians by assuring their effort is not wasted in collecting data on measures that are not feasible or informative. This testing provides an opportunity to refine draft measure specifications before they're implemented that will yield accurate and consistent data for performance program scoring. Next slide. All right, this next slide really just is an overview of the measure life cycle. So the first is the measure conceptualization, identifying an opportunity for improvement that would have a high impact. Once this is identified, you would move on to the measure specification, and it lays really the foundation in which a measure can be tested. When the measure testing starts, you would assess the suitability of the specification and gather empirical evidence to identify the strengths and weaknesses within a measure. Those strengths and weaknesses can then later be refined so the measure can move towards implementation. Implementation could be in a number of ways. So as I had mentioned, QCDRs are encouraged to collect data 12 months prior to, or implementation could be within a new program or within the self-nomination process. And lastly, the measure used, the continuing evaluation and maintenance. We would expect that QCDRs review the literature and reevaluate annually to ensure that the measure is in alignment with the most recent clinical guidelines. For QCDR measures, we would require those updates to be made during the self-nomination process, and mid-year changes are not permitted. Next slide, please. So we'll transition into the more of the detailed components of measure testing. First off is the alpha testing. This occurs before the detailed specifications are fully developed, often during the information gathering of empirical analysis to test the feasibility and measure's importance. This determines whether the individual data elements are available and whether the form in which they exist is consistent with the intent of the measure. Types of testing done in the alpha test vary widely and often depend on the measure's data source or uniqueness of the measure specification. Beta testing involves a comprehensive and large-scope field testing of measure specifications generated during alpha testing. This assesses the scientific acceptability and usability of the measure and may evaluate the measure's suitability for risk adjustment or stratification and further expands on previous importance and feasibility evaluations. Carefully planned and well-executed beta tests can help establish evaluation criteria of later measure and performance. Next slide. We'll dive into reliability next and this is really looking at the precision of the measure. It evaluates whether the measure data elements that are extracted over time produce the same results a high proportion of the time when assessed in the same population in the same time period, and or that the measure score is precise. It refers to reproducibility of the same result from a repeated measure. The lack of permission demonstrates random error within a measure. Conceptually, reliability is the measure of the ratio between signal to noise. We also provided a equation for you for your review. Signal being the proportion of variability within a measure due to true differences in performance, and the noise is the proportion of variability in the measure performance due to the measurement error. Reliability tests include inter-rater reliability in data abstractor studies, internal consistency for multi-item scales, retest and retest for survey items, and then the reliability testing of the measure score addresses precision of measurement, and that example would be that signal to noise ratio. All right, next slide, please. When testing, there are some threats to keep in mind. Threats to measure reliability are those factors that can cause or are sources of systematic and random error. Some of these factors stem from ambiguous measure specifications, poor instrument design leading to imprecise measurement, and inconsistent data collection. For example, if you are measuring heart failure without specifying the types of heart failure that should be reported. So for example, systolic versus diastolic, right-sided versus left-sided heart failure. Next slide, please. We did want to provide just an algorithm. This is based on the NQF measure evaluation and guidance for measure endorsement, and it just serves as an example. It provides general guidance on how to rate a measure's reliability. However, it is not always applicable to every measure, and special considerations may be required, and they may not be called out within this particular algorithm, but did want to mention that there are great resources as you're looking at your measure out on the NQF. This is, as I said, the measure evaluation criteria and guidance for evaluating the measure for endorsement. Next slide, please. We'll transition over to measure validity. This is looking at measures accurately representing the concept being evaluated and achieves the purpose for which it is needed, i.e. measure quality. It is often appropriate to obtain stakeholder input at several points during the testing process, which includes obtaining face validity inputs at alpha testing, feasibility and burden inputs at beta testing, and other inputs based on the review of the overall results. For example, the QCDR measure should clearly identify the concept being evaluated, would be linked to the face validity, including all necessary data elements, codes, tables, data sources to detect positive occurrence when one exists, and this would be that construct validity. Next slide, please. A few obstacles when looking at validation. Complex specifications may make a measure more susceptible to varying data field interpretation by different users. Small errors in the measure specifications, such as omission of codes for commonly documented concepts and value sets, can reduce the capture of appropriate patients in the measure's denominator. Users may enter information into specified measure fields other than those from which a vendor extracts the data for measure reporting. Next slide. We'll evaluate the validity threats. In addition to unreliability, some aspects of the measure specifications and data can affect the validity of conclusions about quality. Potential threats include patients excluded from measurement, differences in patient mix for outcome and resource use measures, measure scores generated with multiple data sources, methods, multiple measure specifications, and then, of course, the missing data and non-response. Next slide, please. As I stated before, this is just an algorithm from the NQF that serves as an example, and we have included a direct link within the resource within this presentation for you to take a look at. And this document really has a lot of valuable information that we would encourage you guys to go look at when evaluating the validity of a measure specification. Next slide. All right. So taking a peek at the evaluating the scientific acceptability from the NQF perspective, this is based on the key points for evaluating scientific acceptability document located on the NQF website. The measure must be both reliable and valid. Empirical demonstration of reliability and validity is expected, although for new measures, demonstration of face validity of the measure score as an indicator of quality is also allowed. NQF is not prescriptive about how the empirical measure testing is done. Similarly, NQF does not set minimum thresholds for reliability or validity testing results. Reliability and validity must be demonstrated for the measure as specified, including the data sources and the level of analysis. NQF allows testing at either the data element level using the patient level data or at the performance measure score level using data that has been aggregated across providers. When evaluating the measure's testing results, the method of testing, the data used for testing, and the results of the testing must be considered. Next slide. We also wanted to provide a couple of ECQM tools that might be helpful in specification of ECQMs. First is the Measure Authoring Tool. This is a web-based tool that allows measure developers to author ECQMs using the CQL and the QDM language. Provides the ability to express complex measure logic and export measures in several formats. As mentioned, the CQL, Human Readable HL7 standard structured to process electronic queries. QDM, information model that defines relationships between patients and clinical concepts in a standardized format to enable electronic quality performance measurement. Also, another tool for ECQMs is the Bonnie tool. This is a virtual testing environment and application with realistic patient data. It allows ECQM developers to test and verify the behavior of the ECQM logic and supports loading of measures that are constructed using the MAT to execute measure logic against the environment to evaluate if the authored measure logic aligns with the intent of the measure. Next slide. Now transitioning over from the testing requirement into the linking to cost and improvement activities or a future consideration of an MVP. QCDRs must indicate the measure's feasibility by linking to at least one of the following at the time of self-nomination. That being said, it would be a cost measure or an improvement activity for the upcoming self-nomination. If there is no clear link to CMS, CMS would consider exceptions if the potential QCDR measure otherwise meets the QCDR measure requirements and considerations. For example, if there is not a link to a cost measure because the specialty is not reflected within the cost measure inventory, and the QCDR would then indicate that there were no cost measures during the QCDR measure submission. Next slide. All right. And the last requirement and thing to consider is the low adoption. So failure of a QCDR measure to meet benchmarking thresholds for 2 consecutive performance periods, the data submitted is insufficient in meeting the case minimum and volume thresholds required for benchmarking. QCDRs do have the opportunity to submit a participation plan for low reported QCDR measures not meeting the benchmarking thresholds, but the QCDR does believe that this addresses an important and relevant aspect to a specialist practice. The QCDR may develop and submit a measures participation plan for CMS's consideration. Next slide, we'll take a deeper dive into those requirements. A detailed plan and method to encourage eligible clinicians and groups to increase QCDR measure adoption. This could be anywhere from a development of an education or communication plan, update the QCDR measure specifications with changes to encourage broader participation, or require reporting on the QCDR measure as a condition of reporting through that QCDR. And that wraps up my portion of the presentation, and I will pass it over to Marla, and she can review some of the resources available to the QCDRs.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Next slide, please. One of the major resources that are available to the QCDRs and that CMS and the PIMS team really encourage every QCDR to take advantage of is a measure concept preview call. And these calls will be available from January 20th through the end of May 29th of 2020. The last day to request a call or actually send in your request is May 15th. When you send in the request to the email, you provide multiple dates of availability over a 2-week period and whether you want an in-person or virtual meeting. You include email addresses of all those who would like to attend, as well as a document, either a single Word or Excel document with all the measure concepts and specifications be sent in at least a week prior to the meeting. This is in order for the PIMS team and CMS to really go over your proposed specifications and then give meaningful feedback during your one-on-one call. Please note that no measure decisions are made on that call. At that time, at the time of your call, we have no way of knowing what measures are going to be submitted officially during the self-nomination period. Next slide, please. Currently, we do have a QCDR measure development Google group. You can see the link there. This is a space for QCDRs to collaborate on QCDR measures and to share ideas throughout the QCDR measure development process. We would like to note that this group has been available for about 1.5 years now, almost 2 years, and it has not seen essentially any use at all. So we will be reevaluating whether or not we are going to continue to manage the group site after the self-nomination period ends in September. Next slide, please. And then here you will find for a list of different resources, many that Jocelyn spoke to as well as Stacy. This first one is the actual link to the final rule, the 2020 final rule, that is a great place to really look at requirements. We have the blueprint for the CMS Measures Management System, the NQF measure evaluation criteria, which were those examples that Jocelyn showed, as well as the measure development plan and annual reports. Next page, please. These are also links to the measure management system, and then finally to the 2020 QCDR measure specification file, which shows all current active 2020 QCDR measures. Also, the CMS Resource Library has additional reference materials, which will be updated in the spring for the 2020 performance period of MIPS. Next slide, please. And finally, this is a resource one-stop shop for the most current electronic clinical quality improvement. So ECQI Resource Center, you see those four there. And then again, here is actually the link at the very bottom to that QPP resource library that I referenced on the last slide. Next slide, please. We are about to enter a question and answer session. This will be led by our by Lauren. And Lauren, if you'd like to start that process.
Perfect. Thanks so much. All right. So yes, we will shortly begin the Q&A portion. Just quickly wanted to draw everybody's attention here. So if you are interested in providing feedback or collaborating further with CMS on the quality payment program, we always encourage you or anyone you know to participate in our human-centered design efforts. So please do just email our team at QPP User Research at cms.hhs.gov if you're interested. All right. Otherwise, we will begin the Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll unmute your line. You can raise your hand by checking that little hand icon to the left-hand side of your go-to menu. It'll appear green next to your name, and then we'll always call your name before unmuting your line so that you're aware. Otherwise, you can submit a question via the chat box in the questions tab on your screen, and we will answer that way. All right, so to start us off, we have a question asking, will the NQF support CMS in the review of QCDR measures and testing submissions?
This is Sophia Sigmar from CMS. To answer the question, NQF will not be supporting CMS as we review the measures. To be fair, the volume of measures we typically have is quite a lot, and we do have a specific process in place that utilizes CMS staff and our subject matter experts within our contracting staff to help review the measures. And so we will continue to use that process. And we will, if there are any changes in the future, that will be communicated to our QCDR participants.
Great, thank you. All right, next question asks, please help us to understand the definition of link or provide the parameters for what an acceptable link is between measures and the cost or improvement activities category.
Yeah, I can take this one. So I think what we're looking for is just the quality measure to complement the IA or the improvement activity or cost measure. So for example, if you were to complete an improvement activity that was looking at, implementing a health coach for diabetic patients, and how does that directly link to measure 1, which is A1C control, how are those working in tandem to achieve better quality care?
Perfect, thank you. All right, your next question asks, what format should we expect to submit measures in? Will it be the MIF and MJF from the blueprint or a separate format?
I don't think we have not standard or finalize what format we would want to. I think I have those. We may not require just the MIF form. We will be putting together a similar QCDR measure submission template. However, it will have expanded fields to address all of the new requirements for 2021.
Perfect, thank you. All right, we have a few questions coming in on the phone line. So Helene Oliver, we're going to unmute your line. All right, so Helene, it looks like you're self-muted. If you'd like to unmute your line, we'd be happy for you to ask your question. All right, so while we wait for that, we'll go ahead and ask a question from the chat box. Your next question is, if a QCDR measure is submitted with data collection from a registry, will CMS provide G codes for measure constructs when claims or billing codes are not available?
So we do not provide G codes for QCDR measures. As of now, those would be only limited to the MIPS quality measures.
Perfect, thank you. All right, next question. Is alpha and beta testing required before 2021 self-nomination?
Yep, full measure testing would need to be completed prior to self-nomination.
Perfect. All right. Next question is, how likely are process measures to be accepted or rejected, and what makes a process measure more likely to be accepted?
So I think I can help a little bit. I think one of the things is process measures if they're checkbox. So what do we mean by that? Is it a simple assessment, or is there some sort of quality action associated? We do see a lot of QCDR measures that are submitted, and it's purely just a checkbox and nothing to follow up and ensure that they're providing adequate care or quality care, for that matter.
And
Yeah, and just
I was just going to add another piece to that. This is Daryl Roberts from GDIT. The process measures that are tightly linked to an outcome that could be a proxy for an outcome that you really can't measure are also relatively acceptable. They're called interim outcome measures that make it easier to examine something that is a proxy for the outcome, but not necessarily the outcome itself.
All right, great, thank you. All right, looks like we have a question on the line from Eden Essex. So Eden, we're going to go ahead and unmute your line, and you may go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for answering the question about the link. I had submitted that. And I get it conceptually. I guess I don't understand like how it's going to be done mechanically. Like, do we write a rationale, and are there parameters for accepting or rejecting that rationale? If you could expand on that, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, I think we would. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jocelyn. You got it.
I was actually going to just say we'd request that a rationale would be submitted during self-nomination, but Sophia, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think we, just to add to that, yes, we will ask for a rationale, for you to provide that rationale at the time of self-nom, but then we've generally kept it broad to provide QCDRs the opportunity to create that linkage. So we really defer to you as the expert in your area, to find and identify these either improvement activities, or if you find a cost measure that is relevant and, meaningful towards the measure you're developing, make that linkage and explain to us how it links. And we're looking for you to provide that, use your background and your knowledge and creativity to provide that explanation of a linkage. We don't have any specific strict standards that we're looking for or criteria. I think if in any case that we have any questions upon reviewing your rationale, that is something we will come back to you as a team to get further explanation on.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eden. Next question is from the chat box, and it asks, we commend you for raising the scientific measurement standard by following NQF standards more closely. Does CMS have staff who are of the same level of psychometric expertise as the NQF scientific methods panel?
Hi, this is Kristen Welkerhood. Actually, Dr. Kristen Welkerhood and Dr. Daryl Roberts. Both of us have our doctorates in measure development and are precisely the type of talent that you would have at NQF and have served with NQF. My background is I'm an expert in survey development, instrumentation, and psychometrics. Daryl, would you like to talk about?
I'm an evaluation scientist with considerable measure development expertise, and that really is what you would be looking for in the folks that are developing the measures, whether for QCDR or really for any other measurement type of approach.
Yeah. And we service needs to this project and are in our own right measure developers.
Great, thank you very much for that clarification. All right, next question asks, do we capture G codes for registry QCDR measures directly from AMA?
So I think we can back up just a step here, and QCRs are not required to use G codes, so they can use a number of different methods for abstracting the data or quality data. I think the CPT2 codes would come from AMA, but I'm not sure that a G code would be created for a QCR measure.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, next question asks, if a QCDR is planning to submit a measure during self-nomination in 2021, should they wait until 2021 for a measure concept preview call, or would it be possible to hold a measure concept preview call in 2020?
This is Sophia. So we would encourage you to, if you're trying to develop a measure now or you have a measure concept in mind, request the preview call as soon as possible in 2020, just so everyone's aware in terms of timeline. You are self-nominating between July 1st and September 1st of 2020 for the 2021 self-nomination period. We've already concluded all of our review processes for the 2020 performance period as of last fall, and we've posted all of our approved QCDRs and their QCDR measures for the 2020 performance period on our website. So it's to your benefit to have it as soon as possible. So I would, as the opening of that time frame occurs, and I'm sure Jocelyn can remind you of that time frame, I would highly suggest you reach out to the team to get your call scheduled.
Hi, this is Stacy too with the PIMS team. Just to kind of add to that, we are accepting requests for these measure preview calls via the QCDR support mailbox. And we will take the calls between January 20th and May 29th, and requests can be made up through May 14th. So just reach out if you'd like to schedule one to the QCDR support mailbox, and we can help you try to get that scheduled.
Great, thanks. All right, just as a reminder to everybody on the phone line, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to submit it via the questions box, or you can raise that green hand to the left of your screen, and we will go ahead and unmute your line, and you can ask a question over the phone line. So nope, doesn't actually look like we have any questions on the phone line, but again, if you'd like to, just raise your hand and we'll get a notification, and we'll always say your name before unmuting your line. So just give it a few more minutes to see if more questions come in. All right, we'll just give it a few more moments to see if anybody is typing out a message. Again, if you would like to submit a question, please do so via the questions tab on your screen. And we'd be happy to answer anything over the phone as well. Just mark the green hand to raise your hand and we will unmute your line. So we'll give it a few more minutes.
Hi, this is Daryl Roberts. I just found for those of you who are planning to submit measure concepts for the QCDR or for other means, the one thing I would remind people to do is use the blueprint very, very closely. It's a cookbook, and like any cookbook, it tells you how to do it to a certain taste. It's not necessarily going to be the exact way that you'll do everything, but it sets those minimum criteria. And the more closely you adhere to that, the more likely you will be to obtain NQF endorsement, that you will be able to obtain CMS approval, and that you'll be able to make sure that that measure actually works in the field in real time, in real space. So I highly recommend that you understand that blueprint and follow it very closely.
And this is Kristen Welkerhood. One additional point to what Daryl was just saying. In the blueprint, there are appendix chapters that go very deeply into testing, both alpha and beta testing. And so if you wanted a deeper explanation of the presentation that we gave you today, that would be a really good launching point for that, to get you ready for your concept meetings that we discussed.
Great, thank you both. All right, again, if anybody has questions on what was just recapped or on any part of the presentation, please just submit your question box. We'll give it a few more minutes. All right, we just got a request for the Blueprint resource link to be reshared, so we'll go ahead and submit that via the chat box now. And so just give it a few more minutes and that will be posted. We did just get one more question following that says, is a 12-month data collection requirement for is there a 12-month requirement for data collection for new measures as well?
The data collection requirement, which is separate from the testing requirement, we encourage you to have at least 12 months of data. That's helpful for you to show that the measure is implementable and reliable, but also from our perspective and a scoring perspective, it gives us a forecast of how soon your measure will be able to meet our case minimums for benchmarking purposes. The requirement is for all measures, existing QCDR measures and new measures.
Great, thank you very much. All right, and again, that link was just reshared, so you'll see that coming up in your in your chat box very shortly. Okay, so it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Thank you very much to everybody. Oh, sorry, one more question actually just came through. Just wanted to ask whether there is a 30-day public comment period required for submission.
We do not require a public comment period for your QCDR measures. Now, if you have submitted a MIPS quality measure concept through a call for measures process, then that would go through the notice and comment rulemaking and would be open for public comment. The QCDR measures are reviewed and approved in a separate process, So for purposes of your measure being considered, we do not require it. We do know that many of our QCDRs who are also measure stewards in the program do move forward with that public comment process, and that is to your discretion. We leave it to you, but that is not something we specifically require.
Great, thank you. All right, I saw a couple of hands flag very quickly and flag back down, so please feel free to re-raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question over the phone line. Next question asks, when will we receive the final measures?
The final measures, as in the QCDR measures for 2020, have been delivered or sent out to the different QCRs. And then in addition, the QCR specifications for 2020 are located on the QPP resource library. So those are already available for 2020.
All right, thank you very much. All right, we'll just give it another moment or two for questions to filter in. Otherwise, we will go ahead and close off the webinar. So if you have another question, please feel free to submit either way, and we will answer it. All right, wonderful. So it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Thank you again to everybody who's joined and to everybody who's asked a question. I'm going to turn it back over to Susan Arday from CMS to go ahead and close out the webinar.
Hi, this is Susan Arday. I really want to thank you all for joining us today in our ongoing dialogue in this process. It's a pleasure to be able to hear from you and to share this information with you. I'd like to thank our speakers for their presentations, and please don't hesitate if you have further questions to reach out to us through the qpp@cms.hhs.gov mailbox. Thanks a lot, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.